you all for joining us today. So before we begin, just allow me to say a few words about us. Delhi Comparatists is a group of faculty and research students associated with the University of Delhi, and we began working together in 2011. Ever since, we have organized seminars on a few themes like comparative manuscriptology, social epistemology, and manuscript cartography. Since 2020, we have been working on projects like COVID-19 cultural response archiving and research, digital humanities in India, and multilingual translation methodology. Past and present members of the Intermediality research group under Professor Satyanath and Professor Amitava Chakraborty have worked on topics ranging from Ragmala paintings, illuminated manuscripts, as well as picture storytelling traditions. We are delighted to have Dr. Nandini Chandra inaugurate the group's webinar series today. Dr. Nandini Chandra is an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. Her book, The Classic Popular Amar Chitra Katha, was published by Yoda Press in 2008. She has published widely on Indian comics, childhood and youth subcultures, the neoliberal university, and Hindi literary modernity. We welcome you, ma'am, and I'll request you to take over from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nilza, for inviting me, and thank you very much for having me. And yeah, I understand today is Sunday for you guys, so for taking out, whatever free time you have to listen to me. So I'm really grateful. So I'm going to speak about Bhimayana, of course, but I've spoken about Bhimayana so many times, so I thought I would do something different. And also, I thought I would respond to the concept of intermediality today that your group is all about. And so I decided to look at this question of, what comic language represents. So my talk is today going to be organized around this understanding of, the two language theory of gesture and speech by this anthropologist and paleontologist, Andre Leroy Durhan, where he talks about these two kinds of speech. One is the language of hearing, which is linked to the sound coordinating areas, and which is the phonetic system, the system of writing that we speak in, that we discourse in. And then there is the language of sight, which is connected with developing the gesture coordinating areas. The gesture is being translated into graphic symbols, so which is the visual language. And the comic medium, as it developed through the commercial genres, is essentially a gestic language system. And so when the comic language tries to incorporate other languages, other more indigenous systems, say like in Bhimayana, we see how it's incorporating the Pradhan Gond Digna style with more archaic and primitivist associations. Then we encounter some problems, but also like certain productive tensions. So what happens then when this kind of media transpositions or coordination of different medias belonging to different temporalities and different technological phases interact with each other? So I will begin with the premise that what has been happening rather, or not in a kind of abstract, speculative way, what has happened, what one can witness in the graphic novel, at least in the recent history of graphic novels, which have displayed this propensity to increasingly flirt with these so-called indigenous idioms, indigenous gestic languages. So what happens there is that it brings into prominence a kind of almost a fetish with the artisanal, and which in turn leads to a fetishism with the decorative. So today my talk is about this decorative turn in graphic novels. So previously in my work on Bhimayana, I've spoken disparagingly about this decorative turn. But today I'm going to speak in a very complimentary way about the role of decoration, using Walter Benjamin's understanding of the Baroque. So I'll mostly be reading to save time because I tend to go off in tangents. So I'll start reading. The art of comics is very close to artisanal work insofar as it involves painstaking and time-consuming labor, repetitive panel work with the slightest modifications. Like, so what Scott McLeod tells us about the various kinds of transitions. And of course, the ones shown in this picture are moment to moment and action to action. So while the moment to moment has very slight modifications, the action to action has more significant variations. But what I'm trying to express is that traditional comic work, the commercial kind of comic work is tended to be very artisanally oriented because it was painstaking. It required repetition of similar kind of picture frames again and again, without much variation. So it's not as if that only the graphic narrative has inaugurated the artisanal turn. The comic medium itself was always, in some senses, artisanal. But in the niche graphic novel market, the artisanal work gets a special elaboration. In Munnu, Malik Sajjad reproduces the fine wood engravings of his artisanal father's craft, into which he has been initiated as a child. So here we see his father chiseling, engraving these paisleys and decorative kind of features onto walnut cabinets and furniture. And little Munnu over there, he's sitting and drawing on the wood. And his father tells him that, this is too expensive. Go and try your artwork on paper. So, there's a kind of mutual imbrication of these kinds of artisanal work and comic. And so the training in artisanal work is seen as a kind of stepping stone to being a comic artist. Detailing, filling in, coloring, inking, and lettering is now digitalized in commercial comic production, although it used to be performed by a team of specialized workers. In contrast, these grueling manual tasks have become part of the individual graphic novel artist's self-appointed labor. Graphic novels have all the artisanal value that commercial comics have lost, and it is continually being augmented. This artisanal emphasis has contributed to a decorative turn in graphic novels, which is exemplified in the use of color, folk patterns such as paisleys and trellises, or other ornamental features. This inclusion of the decorative speaks to a loss of function or telos in narrative. In other words, the decorative features seem to play no part in the narrative progression of the comic. They are rather related to stillness and stasis, to being rather than doing. The comic medium at its peak was defined by a strong anti-aesthetic impulse. Embodying the Bauhausian ethic of form follows function. The function being entertainment through an immersive experience in action. In the commercial comics, through which the comic medium developed its unique language and grammar, the purpose was feel good, having a laugh, getting thrills out of typical horror and crime plots. Through a dialectical movement between the conscious pictorial content of the frames and the almost invisible spaces between the frames, what are known as gutters, the medium was able to elicit a productive relationship between the conscious and the unconscious. No matter how flat or one-dimensional the figures, or perhaps because of this flatness, the alternation between the visible and the invisible, the conscious and the unconscious, the still images and the action ones, The overall experience of reading comics was a moving one, steeped in action, despite their aesthetic minimalism or even anti-aesthetic impulse. So what I'm emphasizing here is that um, the comic medium as it developed, as a kind of modernist form almost, even though it was part of this kind of lowly subgenre, um, and kind of obscured by its tabloidy origins. At the same time, it managed a productive tension between, its primitivist kind of anchoring, the fact that it was based in a pictorial language, and therefore it was accessible to children, and its images kind of bore the associations of the unconscious, so it was more subliminally rich. It was more available to the non-rational means of communication. So even though comics had this element, this kind of pictorial element, which anchored it to a more primitivist dimension, but at the same time, it was also geared towards a kind of more modernist function, that of action, movement, closure, trying to find resolutions. So in that sense, the comic medium is very distinct from these other gestic or pictorial languages that are brought in when the graphic novel is trying to collaborate with them. So decoration occupies a contradictory place in modernism. In the textbook definition of modernism, it is identified with history as progress, making things anew, such that decoration bears the negative connotation of being a useless relic from the past, a decadent excess or excrescence that interrupts the smooth flow of progress. But in modernism's preference for the abstract over the representational schema, we see a subterranean kinship with the decorative. While abstract art's formal functional interface and medium specificity, color, line, and space are not meant to be decorative, and yet the more abstract it becomes, the more it threatens to spill over into the purely decorative. According to the influential art critic Clement Greenberg, repetition and uniformity showcased through abstract art can degenerate into the merely decorative, the kind seen in wallpaper patterns that can be repeated indefinitely. In his view, when the abstract artist grows tired, he becomes an interior decorator. Ironically, this sense of the sign as sheer sensuality or texture, which Greenberg characterizes as degenerate, becomes the pivotal force behind Walter Benjamin's understanding of the Baroque expression of modernism. The OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, identifies Baroque with styles of ornament characterized by profusion, oddity of combination, or abnormal features. When there's an element of the grotesque about it, as much as the element of jewelry, like something ornamental, gold, gilded. According to Joseph Samutari, who writes on the theories of the Baroque, he cites Benjamin in The Origins of Tragic Drama. He says the relationship between the image and its meaning is purely conventional. The gesture contains none of its meaning within itself, and as such, each gesture takes on the potential to function as an enigmatic hieroglyph to be deciphered. So, what I'm talking about here is like the Baroque definition of decoration, which, because the decorative appears to kind of visualize the fact that the relationship between the sign and the thing is totally arbitrary. like which is defined through convention. So when we see all these the ornamental aspects of indigenous art, we do not have an interpretive system to understand them. There's no kind of secure grounding through which we can understand their relationship, even though it might be a flower. And yet the kind of ornamental nature of that flower detaches it from an actual object, from its natural state, as it were. So it becomes this kind of, it's conventional, but at the same time, it's a convention which is also, which has lost its kind of anchoring in a real world of objects. So, and that's why the decorative seems superfluous. Like it has nothing whereby we can understand it, So the gesture contains none of its meaning within itself, and as such, each gesture takes on the potential to function as an enigmatic hieroglyph. And this is where Benjamin kind of draws on its productive potential of being read as an allegory. So in other words, in this non-representational system of gestic language, the signs don't correspond to any immediate thing and need to be interpreted. Yet there is no secure ground for interpretation. The metaphysical system that gave these signs meaning has become defunct and obsolete. Far from looking at history as progress or salvation, the Baroque embodies a mournful way of looking at the past, pointing in turn to an allegorical reading of history. Allegory is identified with contemplating everything that has seemingly become non-instrumental, useless, defunct, everything mournful and sorrowful and lost to history. It favors the action of remembrance, messianic communication with the past, with the forgotten history of the oppressed, which raises the dead and seeks to redeem their oblivion by the light of learning, offering a redemptive re-evaluation. More than all this, allegory is resolutely mournful, disabused of any naively optimistic views of action. So in some senses, the uselessness of decoration is then tied to a different interpretation schema, whereby the uselessness is the fact of a loss of its anchoring with a signifying system that could make meaning out of it. And so it also relates to all the obsolete figures, people who've lost, the oppressed of history, who've been thrown into oblivion, who've been discarded. So there's a kind of productive meaning of the decorative that we are excavating via Benjamin's Baroque. So, I mean, it's almost like an act of excavating the dead, raises the dead and seeks to redeem their oblivion by the light of learning and offering a redemptive re-evaluation. So unlike the meaning of decoration that was posed by Greenberg, where decoration is seen as degenerate, or decadent, as not fulfilling the promise of form follows function. Instead of that, here we see that the decoration becomes a way of, and in that form follows function kind of credo, we have a vision of modernism in which history is progress. That it's like a project of futurity. It's imbued with promise, because future is going to, through kind of actions, it's going to protest, through revolutionary actions, history is going to be kind of realized. But here we have a much more contemplative and mournful understanding of history. History as a kind of compendium of lost or unresolved figures, forgotten figures, oppressed figures. And so, like, retrieving those or re-evaluating those is going to bring us to a different kind of interpretation of the world we are living in. And so it's not just geared towards an instrumentalist approach towards revolution. It is difficult to find closure or resolution in this contemplative approach to history. But thinking through its various gestic or imagistic manifestations, we are able to recover something that had been forgotten. Although not conducive to action or representation, it offers a different interpretation of the past. So the decorative in comic art is introduced to us through encounters with Baroque mediums such as folk art, tribal, zoomorphism, primitive sculpture, prehistoric tools, etc. They appear as figures of decoration precisely because what fulfilled their functionality no longer exists. Their appearance in the modern adaptation is devoid of any connection to anything functional. How do we assess media collaborations in terms of the profusion of these Baroque figures that erupt as sheer sign without any signifying structure? Amit Datta, a young experimental filmmaker, known for his imaginative adaptation of the lexicon of various folk art such as Pahari, Gond, Varli, etc., attempts to understand these material relics of the past through a filmic appreciation of their obscure qualities. This takes the form of magnifying an obscure detail like a little squirrel in the painting, or animating the still frames through a live recreation. Panning the camera over the miniature painting with such absorption that the filmic duration spent over it, the painting, far exceeds the actual time, possibly required to scan the image. This returns us from measurable time to the time of human experience, which is discontinuous and not in sync with capitalist time. Responding to a question on medium transpositions in his work, in an interview with Shambhavi Kaul, he says, when every medium becomes clue to the operation of every other medium, the possibilities become infinite. Thus, we have here a redemptive revaluation of obscure motives and obscure painters that are otherwise only viewed in terms of class power, insofar as this kind of decorative art exists as a luxury commodity or a mark of status. In my paper today, I'll explore this Baroque idea of decoration in graphic novels, and not the Greenbergian idea of art as, decorative art as degenerate. The figure of the Baroque, as we saw, is introduced through a collaboration between multiple mediums, which in turn signifies multiple temporalities and multiple technologies. For instance, in Datta's films, he attends to the folk forms by recreating a soundscape that invokes these different material practices. The sound of metal, wood, tools peculiar to that age are, however, recaptured through modern technology. The idea is not to produce an authenticity of experience where things are exactly how they are depicted in the painting, though it may seem so, but to help realize the potential of the medium that is the means of communication now, meaning the film technology. It is not fidelity to the Baroque object, but to its historical possibilities as expressed through the mediating medium. Thus, even though the Pahari landscape, or the landscape of the Pahari painting is reproduced with relative fidelity, the act of allegorical reading does not lie in merely pointing to a landscape that resembles it most accurately and feeling good about having recreated an authentic setting. So this kind of links to the fact that it's non-representational ultimately. Even though there is in Amit Datta's paintings, there's this kind of realism or mimesis going on, and yet it is enacted not so much to reproduce a fidelity to the real, but to seize new meanings from old ones, even if they depart from apparent semblances. It is then appropriate from the allegorical point of view that the task of making Bhimayana, the biography of Baba Sahib Bhimrao Ambedkar, and his account of the evil of caste is handed over to Subhash and Durga Bhaigam, a Pradhan couple known for their accomplished use of Digna art. The Digna art is a form of gestic or visual language that is distinct from phonetic sound-based language. It is paradoxical that the gestic language, with its halo of associated images and archaism, is tasked with documenting the chronicle of caste atrocities. And why is this so absurd? This is because the phonetic language has developed over millennia precisely so that it can do this work of recording, of efficient documentation, of this kind of linear technological efficiency, which includes writing national chronicles, record keeping, and keeping accounts. So the phonetic language is actually the archive of these kinds of recordings, of this kind of linear kind of recordings of caste atrocities or writing chronicles based on chronological time. And the gestic language performs a very different function. And it's best recognized, the gestic language is best recognized for enabling a means of non-rational communication. Its imagistic quality lending a more ready access to the unconscious. As the art of the Vyams reveals, it is very good at capturing the pain of Ambedkar and Dalits, but it is unable to do the archival work of documenting the caste atrocities in a chronological fashion. And this comes across when, as a compensation for this lack, the makers or the editors of this volume insert large chunks of newspaper reports, which is expressed in phonetic language, to detail the contemporary history of caste abuse. So it's like this kind of skewedness. So even though you are giving the responsibility of telling the story of Ambedkar and the Dalits caste abuse to this gestic pictorial primitivist language, and yet you are aware that they are not going to be able to do perform the function of a kind of linear recording of caste atrocities. So the priorities are in a sense confused in that sense, And so I mentioned that this gestic language of indigenous provenance is of course separate from the phonetic language, but it's also separate from comic language, the language of comic medium, even though both are gestic languages, both are visual languages, both are pictorial languages. As Tom Gunning writes in The Art of Succession, comics do not simply combine words and images, but rather contaminate and transform one by the other. In comics, images forced into a flow of succession take on the form of reading, while writing regains the dimension of imagery. But the gestures of comics and that of Digna art are not the same. Even though this particular form of Digna art with improvisatory figures is relatively new, like the whole Jangar Kalam is no more than 40 years old. It started under the tutelage of Bharat Bhavan and Jagdish Swaminathan in the 1980s. But its primitivist associations draw from its allegorical orientation, which is antithetical to continuous action frames of the comic medium. Here's a picture of Jagdish Swaminathan with Indira Gandhi and certain images from Jangar Kalam. This is Jangar Singh Sham's work, and Digna art, as it's traditionally done, it's painted on mud walls and floors. So it's not originally the form in which we see it in the present, in art galleries or in these graphic narratives where these Dignas have been transformed into figures into improvisatory figures, zoomorphic figures, animal shapes, animal and human shapes. And okay. Strictly speaking, one could say that the collaboration between the Digna art and the modern art of comic fails, even though both are gestic forms. But it is possible that the modern medium is a catalyst that pushes it to realize the possibilities of its own gestural language by creating its own rules. In the process, we are left not so much with an insight into the plight of Dalits, as much as that of an oppressed humanity dispossessed of their land and forest. While both Dalits and Adivasis tribals are part of a shared history of oppression, they're discriminated against, humiliated, and suppressed. Yet their imaginaries of oppression and the temporalities to which the oppression is related are very distinct. Both are modern subjects, but carrying different historical valences. In book 4 of Bhimayana, on this image, Durga describes collecting different kinds of seasonal clay, chui mitti, etc., from the riverbed and the forest near her village to paint dignas on her house floor. This organic relationship between her art and the natural settings, especially her relationship to water, is in deep contrast to Ambedkar's childhood, where he is systematically separated from all manner of natural resources. Of course, for the comic, it is no longer the natural materials, but the simulacra of it. Durga says, we now do our paintings on paper and canvas using fabric and acrylic colors. For the fine black and white lines, we use rotring pens. However, our aesthetic draws on our village experience. Ambedkar doesn't even have a memory of similar experience. Different patterns like those of dhan, rice, kodo, mustard, and moa, grass, used in the actual practice of rangoli are copied for filling spaces on paper, and the panels are created to look like fences in a field. Lines and dots and warm earth tones further help in recreating a balance of nature with life, simultaneously reproducing the J. Swaminathan type of, I quote, luminous abstractions, as Uday Vajpayee in his essay on gender color describes them. There is thus a clear gap between the temporalities which Durga and Ambedkar inhabit respectively. According to Walter Benjamin, the artisanal imperative for painstaking work. This is in his essay on the storyteller. So the artisanal imperative for painstaking work, which includes chiseling, filigree, embroidery, applique, embossing, is aimed at achieving perfection, intricacy, finesse, ornament, and accumulation of details. Consequently, it aspires to a temporality in which there is possibility of endless revision and improvisation, a time in which there is no time. Thus, when Durga asks S. Anand, who's the creator of this comic and the founder of I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the collectors. She asks him, Durga asks S. Anand to return, he's come to ask about the progress of their work, and she tells him to return on the weekend. And so it suggests that she, as an artist, has autonomy and she possesses her own time. And this is in like severe contrast to Jangar Singh Sham, the founder of this art movement, who committed suicide because he was being treated as a kind of slave worker in a Japanese museum. And so, I mean, it's obviously an illusion that just by belonging to a tribal ecology that they own a sense of time, as they are drawn into a more capitalist work ethic, one loses that sense of autonomy. But anyways, so what I'm trying to say is that at least there's a memory of that autonomy, whether or not that autonomy actually exists. There's at least a memory of it and remembrance of that living organically in nature and having autonomy over one's time, which is what leads to this kind of artisanal craftsmanship and beautiful objects. The comic economy of several panels within a single page does not give permission to start a page afresh. So in contrast, the comic medium, even though it's also artisanal and requires painstaking work, and yet traditionally, comic artists did not have the luxury of time, because, and so this is from my experience of interviewing Amitava artists, who worked within, who were freelancers working within a commercial system. So they, like some of them told me that, the comic economy of several panels within a single page did not give them permission to start a page afresh if they made a small mistake. So one doesn't just crumple the page and start anew because, there is so much labor. One just draws over it. And so it's not about making things accurate or beautiful. That is the impulse in the comic medium is not beauty, not perfection, but it's like a roughly drawn image. And that is enough. And that is what conveys the kind of plasticity of the human figures and action better than if it were fully drawn. So in contrast, the graphic novel working within the artisanal framework is characterized by a desire to do away with the tyranny of panels and gutter space, clearing the space for an unbroken single page or splash page, which can then act like an independent artwork. So a lot of artists are now drawn to the graphic novel because it's almost a better preferred medium than exhibiting their work in an art gallery, because it's portable, it's more kind of, it transports better. So in that sense, the graphic medium has, or the graphic novel medium has gradually shifted from the anti-aesthetic impulse of the comic medium into an aesthetic one, where it's more about beauty or aesthetic showcasing than functional art, art which is in function of action-driven entertainment. So if the arrival of capital was described by Marx in terms of all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, then the return to a tribal imaginary could be seen in terms of a return to solid states, questions of land, forests, rivers, etc., as well as a restoration of the erratic power of objects and things. In Bhimayana, we see the return to solidity and the sacred performed through the circumscription of caste story within a tribal iconography. The layering, ornamental beauty, and ritual purpose of art within a tribal imaginary is shown above all to perform the task of containment and holding. Durga and Subhash's art is able to contain Ambedkar and by extension the Ambedkarite Dalits' anguish at the unrelenting seriality of caste abuse. But while it is able to console, it is not able to do anything to stop the crimes. It is not action-oriented, like I said earlier. So it's more contemplative, and the gesture of consolation through this kind of caring, it embeds the oppressed Dalit figures within a cosmography, which is full of these caring creatures, non-human. It could be a cat or a dog or a train shaped in the form of an animal who are always keeping the back, or in terms of like holding these oppressed Dalit figures and nursing their wounds, as it were, like holding their wounds, containing them. So But while it is able to control it, it is attempting to see in this repetitive gesture a reversing of the trajectory of inexorable homogenization. What do I mean by this? So in anthropology, the whole movement of civilization is seen as a movement from tribes to caste, class, to general, to a movement towards civilization. And here in the graphic narrative, we find that, in fact, it's the caste is being returned to the tribe. And so it's like from Homo hierarchus, because the movement to stratification like caste and class are a movement towards a kind of more hierarchical systems, whereas tribal society is seen as more equal, egalitarian system. So it's being reversed into a more kind of egalitarian systems. So in this reversal, there's potential not just for a reparative aesthetic to be reinstated, but also one that is more open to destruction. And that is something we don't see in the comics. So that is a potential that is open to interpretation. In tandem with Freud's civilization and its discontents, the dialectical relation affords the possibility of seeing both love and hate, life and death, in a simultaneous movement, not as binaries. While Ambedkar's goal is the annihilation of caste through rupturing the fabric of Hindu civilization, the tribal imaginary seems to domesticate Ambedkar by containing his wounds in an ecology of beauty. But that is only one side of the story, closely controlled by the editorial balance of power in this document. I mentioned earlier that Vigna art is recent. Janveer Kalam is the name given to the artwork inaugurated by Janveer Singh Gyam, who translated his musical imaginary into visual icons. Traditionally, Vignas or auspicious designs have been drawn on the mud walls and floors of Pradhan homes to purify and protect it for centuries. But under Janveer Singh's inspiration, these Vignas or marginalia were improvised into zoomorphic figures. It is clear that what we are calling tribal art belongs to a very modernist moment, made possible by the efforts of painters and artists like Jagdish Swaminathan and institutional places like the Bharat Bhavan. The invocation of an organic relationship with nature need not correspond with an actual historical period, but it is a mythological time determined on the basis of its relationality with capital, or its non-relationality with capital, rather. For instance, the term tribe or Adivasi was introduced by the British to control and administer those they discerned as living outside the net of governmental control, hunting, gathering, and gleaning in the remote recesses of civilization. Ambedkar, of course, rejected the racial theory of caste and untouchability in terms of the invader-aboriginal divide. He tried to show that tribes were in continuity with Hindu society, and Vedic Aryans and present-day Hindus are still tribal in its organization, indistinguishable from the Nagas, Asuras, and Dravidians, neither being identified purely as aboriginal or sharply distinct from such a group. The general anthropological view that Vedic religion is animism turned into philosophy or magic turned into metaphysics traces the inevitable movement from Homo equalius to Homo hierarchus, from an egalitarian tribal society to oppressive caste Hindu one. Okay, I'm going over repeating stuff, so I'm going to skip because I see that we don't have too much time. So the main point I'm trying to establish here is that, even though the word Adi is used, Adivasi is used, as to refer to kind of original inhabitants of the land. And yet, most scholars of, indigeneity or tribal formations will say that it's not so much about being indigenous or the original inhabitants of India as about the fact that they have no power whatsoever over anything, over the territory in which they live. So the emphasis is not about reconstructing a historical chronos, kind of drawing who was the first, who was the second, who was the third, and therefore distributing the privileges based on this kind of chronological fashion, but recognizing those who've been divested of their natural rights. And so I'll skip some parts. Yeah, a little bit of discussion of the way the Bigna art is adapted to the comic medium. So Bignas, we learned, originally served as borders, right? As border decorations. But in the comic, they move to the center of the page. And so, in the form of, and they turn into figures. Instead of just decorative art, they become like trains or trees, grass, animals grazing, birds flying. While the Bigna is brought to the center of the page, the rest of the page is left empty. Huge gaps between the cross-cutting lines. This presents us with a figure-ground relation that is markedly different from the arrangement of panels and gutter in comics. And since we are reading within this kind of understanding that this is part comic, part indigenous storytelling, it's hard not to think of these Bignas in terms of panels, and the empty space in terms of gutters. But that's where the analogy breaks down. So in Bhimayana, these empty spaces are too conspicuous to be able to do the subconscious work of gutter panels, which are very, very thin and sliver-like almost, so as to be unobtrusive. Whereas here you see the empty spaces, and you can't just leap over them like you jump from one frame to the other in a comic. But here the spaces are so wide and so huge that it's impossible to just jump over them. So you have to kind of sit back and contemplate the meaning of it, the meaning of these Bignas. And so they also don't lend themselves to a kind of easy resolution, closure, or action in that sense. They're more static than the images in comic. So I'm going to now skip some and just come to the discussion of the allegorical emblems that the Yams employ in the comic. So they try to adapt to the comic medium, but there are moments when they just retreat into their own kind of gestic language, and which kind of thwarts speech in some ways, thwarts the words. So even though in comics words are working within a pictorial frame, they're not words per se, but here the words are totally divested with. So here we see, I'm going to look at two images that I find are kind of subscribing to this understanding of the allegory as defined by Walter Benjamin. So the first one is this image where, Ambedkar has just been thrown out of this Parsi inn in Baroda, and he has nowhere to go. And so he's sitting on a bench in the park. And so his face turns into the park itself. It is both the ground as well as the mirror for the park. And the image is dialectical in the sense that it reflects the happiness of the park through the face of the man who has been refused access to any part in the happiness. In other words, the image does the conceptual work of illustrating the Dalit plight in which the Dalit body literally ends up serving as the means to the happiness of Hindu society, Savarna society. The image also has a self-enclosed quality without the option of staging or walk out. Like you can't escape from this image because it's circular. It's not linear. You can't move out easily. The other image, which I find corresponds to kind of allegorical one is this fusion image. There's like, in tandem with the fusion image, there's a fusion of symbols, all blurred into one another. So you have Ambedkar. This is supposedly a portrait of Ambedkar, fused into a portrait of Shiva, into one of Buddha, and also one of Gandhi. But these are all very, these suggestions, these traces of these Mahapurushas are very, very tentative, you know. So, so you have Shiva with a matted knot sprouting out of his head in the shape of a fist, and there's Ambedkar's, you know, characteristic finger, which is pointing upwards, and then there are the Gandhi spectacles, you know, which are rounded off. And so while the Buddha and the Shiva overlapping transposition is fairly understandable, because, you know, Ambedkar converted to Buddhism, and the Shiva connotation is also pretty obvious because Vigna, the Pradhan Goans, their deity is this Varadev, who's like a Shiva counterpart. And so there's a kind of fusion of their gods and their into this icon of Ambedkar. But what is perplexing is that why should they bring Gandhi into, why should they fuse Gandhi into this image of Ambedkar? And so it might be true that Ambedkar wore, so one is in a state of radical doubt, because it is true that Ambedkar wore these kind of round spectacles at one point, but the popular imaginary of Ambedkar portraits and statues identifies him with squarish, dark, thick-rimmed glasses, not these Gandhi spectacles. So how do we kind of understand the fusion of Ambedkar and Gandhi? And we also find that this image is surrounded by a lot of quotations. And we can see the influence of the editors and the creators of the comic in this. On the one hand, on one side, you have the Ambedkarite slogan of agitate, educate, organize, and agitate. And on the other side, you have Ambedkar's most Gandhian sentiment to date. I quote, "The battle is in the fullest sense spiritual. There is nothing material or social in it. For ours is a battle not for wealth or power. It is a battle for freedom. It is a battle for the reclamation of human personality." Why do I say that it's the most Gandhian? Okay, so according to D.R. Nagaraj, a Dalit philosopher, Ambedkar's turn to religio-culturalist perspective was enabled by his long and bitter engagement with Gandhi. Their acrimonious interaction changed their respective emphasis and positions on the question of caste relations and untouchability. Gandhi began to address questions of political economy, and Ambedkar internalized the importance of religion. Before this change had occurred, Gandhi would only focus on untouchability, and Ambedkar on the separation inherent in caste as the foundational problem of Hinduism. Gandhi thus confined himself to appealing to the Savarna Hindu sense of mercy and benevolence within a Hinduized idiom, the Bhakti concept of self, whereas Ambedkar coined the slogan of agitate, organize, and educate to create a direct rupture with the Hindu faith. Nagaraj claims that Ambedkar blatantly disavowed the Dalits' shared intimacy with the cultural ethos of Hinduism. In his view, the revivalist RD movements of the early 20th century were able to tap into this shared ethos in order to convert symbols of degradation to symbols of protest and transcendence. Before it appears that Nagaraj is congratulating Ambedkar for his spiritual and mythographic turn, usually said to coincide with his conversion to Buddhism, thanks to his interactions with Gandhi, he tells us that Ambedkar is not interested in finding an alternative narrative of Dalit liberation in the Hindu past, but sees his mythographic journey as a means of affirming the lack of a real affirmative historical past. So the past is not to be scoured for redemption. That is very clear. Ambedkar clearly states in all his tracts and pamphlets that the exploration of Hindu scriptures is a methodological one, impelled by a need to find the origins of the inhuman laws of caste. He seizes the mythographic literature as a means to establish an allegorical or metaphoric map, not a historical one. So two things become kind of clear from this. First, that the return to an originary past is clearly not a means for healing wounds for oppressed communities. And number two, we also catch a glimpse here of Ambedkar exploring a possibly gestic language, which is not his usual language. The dominant language that he uses as a lawyer, as a constitutionalist, as a writer of the Constitution, is the language of the phonetic linear language of power. So it's of rationality. That's his discourse. But here we catch a glimpse of Ambedkar experimenting with a kind of allegorical language, with a metaphoric language, even though, of course, it doesn't translate into images. One could say that the Pradhan Gun iconography is drawn to the implication of this visual language in their allegorical emblems. As mentioned before, the appearance of Gandhi glasses on Ambedkar's face might just be an oversight, but it is precisely these kinds of accidental details or punctum that destabilize the fixed epistemologies of activist narratives written with a prior sense of interpretive control. They force us out of this kind of allegorical reading, then forces us out of the conventional or fixed meanings. Here, Ambedkar's animosity with Gandhi, showing the relationship between the sign and the thing to be totally arbitrary and therefore open to different interpretations, sometimes contradictory ones. At the end, we are left without any control. The figure of Ambedkar amalgamates Buddha, Shiva, and perhaps Gandhi within a Pradhan Gun affective style whose reigning deity is Baladev. The graphic narrative, however, does not end with this fused fantastical image, but is followed by the image of Gandhi as a villain, in case we thought that, the comic was manufacturing lies in some ways. So they make sure that Gandhi appears as a villain. One can see editorial oversight in trying to balance the quotes from the constitutional edicts and the more spiritual language of his conversion to Buddhism. All these multiple cues are supposed to add up to Ambedkar as a complex amalgam and not a single position. But this balancing with words of phonetic language undermines the power of the allegorical, which it finds attractive, but also inadequate to Ambedkar's rational worldview. So here are these, more kind of, so we have here the preamble or letters that were exchanged between Gandhi and Ambedkar. But at the same time, we have this image, where you see the image of Gandhi lying supine with an axe in his hand, like as a symbol of antagonism, of someone who sabotages the Pune Pact. And there's something playful in this depiction. So, of course, Benjamin talks about allegory as a mournful language, but it's also a playful language. Like you see Gandhi as almost like he's not obese here, but he looks kind of plump. And so there's a kind of playfulness with which the antagonisms are being shown here. So I think I'm going to stop here because it's I've exceeded my time, and so I just want to end by saying that while form follows function in the comic medium, the failure of the form to follow function in this kind of intermediality is also very productive. That one learns so much from that failure, that the inability to provide a narrative kind of progression or contribute to a history as progression narrative also allows us to kind of look at it in a more contemplative manner and piece together, reconstruct the past in ways that have not been, that have been overlooked. So thank you very much. And sorry for taking so much time. Should I stop sharing?
Yes. Thank you, Nandini, for such an engaging lecture. I think what I loved most was how, rather than being celebratory, you have been trying to notice ruptures and trying to interpret those. I have a few comments which I would like to discuss, but I think we have questions. Can you look into the chat box? I think there are 2 comments and 2 questions. The first one is, the first one is from Abhishek Pundi. Should I read out for you, or you can see the chat box?
I can see it, yeah. So the gestic and the phonetic language come together in the graphic book and code both perpetual across teleological history and time-anchored history of past histories. Could one also think of inadequacy of one or the other to the stated affect and often contradictory sense making of the two? Yeah, so I agree with this. Is this a comment or a question? Like, since there are so few of us, would Abhishek like to speak, or is that not allowed?
No, that's allowed. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, those who have not posted in the message chat box also can actually come and put their comments, put their questions.
Hi. I was just thinking about the multivalent discourse in terms of contrariness of gestic language and phonetic language in the graphic book. So, of course, there won't be a uniform discourse on caste as well, because we're thinking in terms of 2 languages here, not that they can be in perfect sync with each other. So I was thinking where the discourse ruptures and it gives into multivalent discourse on caste.
So in the sense that, like, you're talking about Bhimayana here, I presume, or are you talking about in general?
And I was referring to Bhimayana.
Yeah. So in so far as like through these, of course, it's a mess because it's there's so many hands about horrific caste atrocity after an phonetic kind of medium. There's so much density of and then there is this more malleable, like fluid language of the pain of caste. But I think what I'm trying to instead of these specific identities, of caste, of tribe, and the juxtaposition of the where tribal iconography is expressing pain of discrimination. What through all this confusion is generalized pain of dispossession, and loses out on the specificity of caste, even though the phonetic discourse is hammering us with it. And yet, because of the dominance of this fluid language, this more gestic language, one is drawn into a more kind of universal tale of shared oppression. And so, yeah, I don't know if I've attempted to answer your question, but feel free to.
Yeah, Abhishek,
Does
would you
that
like to
answer
add
somewhat
something?
answer your question, or
No,
am I
it does.
not
It
getting
does
it?
in the sense that, yeah, that gestic language, which you said, it's a fluid kind of language. And of course, the phonetic, you mentioned that, of course, I've also read the book. So there are these newspaper strips which talk about specific caste atrocities. So, of course, I have also seen that in the book, the gestic language, tries to certain degrees universalize the whole idea of, human atrocity, and whereas the
Mm-hmm.
phonetic language gives it a anchor in history.
Yeah, but history, then, yeah, what I'm trying to say here is that the history is it really effective? Even though, so they might as well have written a kind of report, as a kind of fact-finding
Mhm.
committee. But does the comic medium or does this graphic medium lend itself to that kind of historical account taking, that kind of chronicling?
Mhm.
And why not let if you've given the task um, to this kind of more primitivist tribal artwork, then why not let them realize the full potential of what they can do? By
Mhm.
mixing this kind of creating this hybridity, there is a kind of form confusion. It neither works that way nor it works this way. So we are left with a kind of muddle.
Mhm.
That's my reading. But I feel that whatever the Pradhan goals, the Vyams do works.
Mhm.
They are at least able to realize something through those allegorical images that I discussed.
So Nandini, I think there are actually more comments than questions. Um, from Abhishek, there is one question about the slide 18, Gandhi and Ambedkar. Uh, that's interesting. I have come across some. Have you seen this one about
Yeah,
the
I'm reading it here.
Hegelian view of the history? Yeah.
Yeah, of course there is it's not accurate actually because I think it's to do with the sixth schedule where Ambedkar, when he was drafting the constitution, he thought of the Northeast or Assam as tried to create autonomous zones for them because he thought of them as not um, in the same way as he thought of uh, the depressed, so-called depressed classes. The depressed classes were to be seen as part of the Indian fabric, whereas the so-called tribes were to be seen as this kind of outside civilization. So, but I think it's a misunderstanding to see it as disparaging. Like, I think he was that is an implication you can draw from it, but I don't think Ambedkar was trying to say that the tribes are like uncivilized and they should stay like that or some kind of it was a means to protect them rather than given the kind of it was a strategic kind of statement or
Mhm. Uh, of course, I really don't want to contend this point here, but I was also thinking, and somebody says that these are the people who need to be, brought to mainstream society. So there is this somewhere at the back of one's mind, different, people are at different stages of a civilization. Isn't that the view that suggested by Ambedkar?
uh, I like from whatever I've read. I mean, that could be one interpretation, but I don't think because if you read other writings by Ambedkar, he's so clear about no distinction between tribals, and he doesn't believe in the kind of this ethnic separation of people of subcontinent based on tribe, caste, Hinduism, and sees them in a continuum. So that does not then figure that he's thinking of them as different stages of development. So I would rather, it would be more productive to see his thing in terms of kind of, like he was thinking geographically in terms of, so he also his statements are different for different tribal communities. So it's more based on local appreciation of facts rather than a kind of global understanding of tribes as belonging to a different stage of history. So I don't think it can be justified as that.
Yes, if I may join this discussion, from the readings of Ambedkar, I think it's very difficult to think that he actually thought in Hegelian terms of history, because he thought rather what Nandini had a few moments back been underlining is the history of power. Of a few groups have dominated and have kept others dominated, but that does not, doesn't go back in that they are at different stages of history. Interestingly, when Nehru adopted various allowance thesis and tried to keep Northeast and other tribes separate from mainstream, I don't think Ambedkar really actually supported that, because that idea comes from those various stages of history thesis, perhaps. But okay, this is a very interesting discussion which was going on. I think there is another question. Yeah, first I'll take Mukesh Bhairava's question, though perhaps it's not related to your today's talk. Please comment on the title of the text.
Title of Bhimayana?
Yeah, I think that's the question.
Okay, because of its kind of amalgamation with Ramayana.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought it up because it resonates with that image where Gandhi is fused into an image of Ambedkar, and it, yeah, and like when I spoke to the Vyams, their understanding of this, they don't subscribe to, like, firstly, they said that they were not even aware of, when the topic was first brought to them, they were not aware of this history. And they said that, and they're kind of, they don't necessarily think of Gandhi as an antagonist, so it's more this kind of fused spectrum. So, but I don't know to what extent it is the Vyams driving the narrative and the, the kind of the title, and so much as Navaina's kind of imagination, vision. So I don't know. What do you think? What do people think? That's the problem with this technology, I guess. You can't do that.
Who has a comment or a question, or I mean, want to join in discussion, please, you can unmute yourself and join the discussion. So Nandini, I would like to think, I don't have any argument for this, because both the assumptions might fit. I mean, we don't know what the truth is. I would like to think that it refers to Ramayana as a counter narrative, but after you are referring to Navayana, I'm okay, I'll not be so sure anymore. True.
No, but I also, like, I would have been more, would have drawn more negative meanings out of it earlier, but now with, with my reading of this kind of allegorical reading, whatever the intention of the makers, one sees that, there are different possibilities, which doesn't mean that, one should...
but maybe...
obscure history.
Yeah. But maybe when Navayana named themselves Navayana, with some ideological understanding, maybe they, from the beginning, were referring to creating an alternative to the Ramayana
Yeah.
tradition.
Yeah, so it's all about alternative, yeah.
Perhaps that would be interesting to know from the
Hindu,
founders.
alternative to the Hindu Ramayana.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, that's, yeah. No, that makes the most sense, yeah. I think they mentioned that once. I've forgotten. You
Ma'am,
brought the memory back.
maybe apart from positing a counter narrative to the Ramayana, uh, it may be an attempt to invoke the same kind of resonance that Ramayana enjoys as a popular text in India. So maybe with that aim, it has been named as Bhimayana. Apart from, of course, with that intent of positing it as a counter narrative to the Ramayana. Do you think so that
Absolutely.
to probably
Yeah.
capture that resonance of being a popular text, Ramayana being a popular
Exactly,
text? So,
yeah. It's a dramatic text. So it's like, and Bhimayana, Ambedkar is also equally popular. So it's like a kind of establishing a healthy rivalry with Ramayana.
because Ramayana has captured the popular imagination in India as a text
Absolutely.
which is there in the
Yeah.
popular imagination. So by placing Ambedkar's biography through this graphic mode, the attempt is to reshape the popular imagination. That there's this hero of the subalterns, Ambedkar. Of course, vis-a-vis Ram, who of course represents the upper caste sections of the Indian society. So maybe using both the ideas and trying to create that message.
I think you're right. Yeah.
This is what I think.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think Jaya Watare, yeah, maybe I'm pronouncing the surname. Yeah, please.
Hi, Jaya.
Hi, it was such a pleasure, listening to your talk after such a long time, guiding us through this uncharted territory of intermediality. I had a few questions, which I think steer away from this topic, just restricting ourselves to Bhimayana, but I have a part of it which is related to it as well. So I wanted to ask, as far as comics journalism is concerned, do we, and your whole idea of decoration and decorative, how do you distinguish it? Like, is decoration seen only a part of as a part of the indigenous art, or can it be also seen in other works, like in other comics? And the second question is Bhimayana then is it safe to call Bhimayana as an example of comics journalism, or is it it doesn't fall into that category at all?
I'll just address your first question about, is decorative only related to indigenous kind of artwork? I don't think so. So, like I mentioned, like there is this kind of movement towards, there's a decorative turn in general, like, you see wall paintings, graffiti work, wall art. You see children baking and ornamenting, the likes of which were only seen in like glossy magazines before. So there is a lot of emphasis on handwork, and also on ornamentation. And, and there's a kind of artisanal celebration of artisanal work. So I guess it doesn't have to be just indigenous, but it's the moment. It's this moment in late capitalism when, like there's a kind of democratization of art impulses. Like everybody wants to be an artist, and everybody can be an artist. And yet this new position of, embracing artwork or becoming artists is not possible in a kind of professional manner, because there are not so many professional positions as artists, not so many economic opportunities. And so you see this kind of proliferation of almost freelance work, of people making jewelry, fashion designing, this kind of slow cooking movements. And all of it is kind of celebrating some kind of ability to decorate with the hands. this kind of, it's a kind of skilled labor, which is also, which has moved away from this kind of hobby and has kind of acquired a expertise almost, where everybody is an expert. So I feel like, and that's, I mean, that it's difficult to just condemn it as a kind of the dilution of high art, into this kind of decoration where, anything, it's just like creation of beautiful things. Of course, it comes with this logic of sustainability, food security, slow movement, So it has this ideological underpinnings in a kind of progressive politics, but at the same time, you can't take away the fact that these are forms which are extremely beneficial to capital. Like this kind of where people are drawing on their own enterprising and entrepreneurship skills to make life more beautiful, or the gentrification kind of neighborhoods, where you so all of them are possible to capture the decorative into capital, into a kind of capitalist momentum. So I don't know if that answers your question.
And the second part, wherein is it like safe to call it identify it as as a work of comics journalism? Is that like?
Like comics journalism, it's in that sense, it's more autobiographical, right? It's based on Ambedkar's this small autobiographical tract about his experiences. So in that sense, I don't know if I mean, how do you mean journalistic?
Yeah, in the sense that
way, or
more like Joe,
which is also autobiographical, but
yeah,
there's a kind of ethno. Are there? Sorry, Jaya. I think I don't have much to say about that, so let's move on to some new questions.
Okay, Nilza has a question. Yeah, Nilza.
Yeah.
This is going to be a little long. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. I was watching S. Anand giving this talk in Hyderabad University recently, where he had mentioned that he had been approached by Madhubani artists and many other artists after the success of Bhimayana to, for many collaborations. And also similarly, you have Tara Books in Chennai, who are also collaborating with the Vyams and with the picture storytelling traditions, Patua in general, the Patuas. So I was just wondering, what we could think of when, you have the graphic novel as a form. Is it like the future of picture storytelling traditions? What changes, what doesn't change? What are the losses or gains we have, once we look at it like that? I hope I'm able to hear your response for this. Thank you.
Can you repeat your question, please? I didn't understand.
I think primarily she wanted you to predict about.
So I can't hear anything, sir. I'm sorry. Please, somebody, Charu, I'll depend on you to repeat what ma'am's response is for this. Thank you.
Please. Okay, I'm writing.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so you're asking like what is the future of, because there's so much collaboration going on between
I think that's what she wanted.
Traditions and the comic graphic mode. Yeah, but it's true, and yet like what I was trying to say through my talk today, but I don't think I succeeded probably, is that these kind of medium collaborations, intermediate collaborations, they succeed only if one of the medium is allowed to realize its potential. Like the example I gave of Amit Datta's films is that even though he is drawing from this older folk traditions, and yet what is it works because what he's realizing is a kind of full potential of the film technology. You know, so it's a kind of collaboration. Doesn't mean that everybody will benefit. That you'll have your comic form also. You'll have this. You'll have that. So it doesn't work in that way. Whereas what seems to work is that the mediating medium, the medium that is mediating the communication for us, should be able to, or at least one of them should be able to explore the possibilities of its form. And so while in Datta's films, it's the filmic medium, because he manages to do various things with that, to express, to bring out something of the essence of those paintings, the Pahari paintings. Yet with Bhimayana, what happens is the Pradhan Digna art is realized, whereas the comic medium, it fails as a comic medium. And that is also true about these various other experiments going on. They end up as illustrated dynamic of the comic medium, which requires a certain progression, a certain kind of orientation to action. And so because of the kind of static nature of their drawings, they end up being these beautiful illustrated books rather than the comic medium. So if only they were allowed to kind of explore their language to the fullest potential, would something of a narrative form might emerge, which is different from the comic medium. So what I'm saying is that like one has to move away from the language of hybridity into something where mediums come together in order to activate each other in their own way, but they don't function necessarily as together. You can't say that one expresses, there's a kind of mutual consolidation. At least like, that kind of utopian possibility doesn't seem to happen. And the reason being that, these languages belong to different temporalities. And by temporalities, I don't mean historical moments, like actual historical moments, but so there are interferences, so of course there should be medium interactions, but they should allow each one to develop their own possibilities to the fullest, or draw out something of the others, which was lost or forgotten in the tradition of, Walter Benjamin's allegories.
Thank you, Nandini. Is there any other question? Otherwise,
So there is a question by Shremoy.
Hi.
Shrimui?
Yeah.
She had a question.
Yeah.
No, that was a comment.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I've read that. Yes. But yeah, from Abhishek,
Can I give these copy of these comments and questions, because right now I'm not able to.
Yeah, sure.
Read them.
So comments I'll send you the chat. Okay. So Shimoy's comment was, these graphics remind me of the graphics of fragmentation of Walter Benjamin, where he employs the term truth content. Benjamin determines that although a work of art begins with its truth content and material content, time divides them. Okay, Abhishek has posted a question just now. I had read about the details of incidents of the life of Baba Saheb before Bhimayana. However, while reading Bhimayana, those very episodes from his life came with a certain force. touched me and set me on the path of rediscovering Ambedkar and Ambedkarism. I wish, how do I think of this within the genetic phonetic language frame?
I think, oh, this question is recent. I thought I had addressed it.
Okay. So is there any other question? Otherwise, okay. I was thinking of two things. I mean, these are just comments while listening to your discussion. You know, if the way you have seen the inclusion of news excerpts, and if I have understood it properly, you have not found it complementary to the genre. But what if there could be a possibility of an alternative explanation if we just try to see these being presented as news excerpts, the newsness of that actually is not just about the content, but also about the newsness or newspaperness which comes to us is visual experience.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
So that might be very, I mean, something from which we can look into that. That was the thought was coming to me.
Yeah, exactly. Like the Constitution, like the way the Constitution.
Yes.
Is
so that
it's a visual symbol. Yeah.
So that might mean something interesting.
Exactly.
And also, while I was your discussion about the last one, where they have put Gandhi specs, I think in Dalit movement as well as in left movement also.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Can you repeat what you were saying?
Yeah, sure. I was talking about this, I mean, use of Gandhi's specs.
Yeah.
So, perhaps even today, when you look at the articulation of Dalit activists and even Marxists, the deification of Gandhi that happened after the independence and particularly after his killing have reached a point where everyone tries to not put themselves against Gandhi. This ideological change has been successfully done by the state. That might be a reason. Apart from, of course, I like the explanation that you gave that, yes, Ambedkar in his journey where he confronted Gandhi, but at the same time also absorbed a few things from him.
That's Nagraj, dear Nagraj.
Yeah, but I would rather find it that in the Indian political system, it has become, ideologically, it has become very difficult to stand, I mean, directly oppositional to Gandhi. I mean, if you look at two particular publications, one is, I have forgotten his name, one revisiting Hind Swaraj, published by someone who actually during the whole JNU crisis in last 2-3 years, the only one who spoke from a rightist stand. And then very recently, P.K. Bajaj and another scholar have come out with a big volume on Hind Swaraj. They don't come beyond Hind Swaraj, but even they also need to accommodate Gandhi in a certain way. I don't know how much this ideological framework worked in their last portrayal where there is Buddha, there is Shiva, and they need Gandhi.
Yeah, but it's that undecidability, which is, I don't think Navaina is accommodating Gandhi in its ideological because I've read articles by S. Anand which are extremely critical of Gandhi, and so I don't think he belongs to a position which is accommodative of Gandhi. But I feel that there is no, it leaves us in a kind of state of radical doubt, because like, why would they do that? Because the entire comic is actually organized in such a way that you see Gandhi and Ambedkar as antagonists. And then you have this figure where suddenly there's this inflection which might make it seem that Gandhi is fused with Ambedkar. And so it helps, I think and I feel that this is a kind of a contribution from the fluidity of that gestic language imparted by the gums. So I don't think it's necessarily coming from Anand, but it's coming from the kind of folk tradition, which draws through this kind of fusion forms. They bring together discrete. It's almost like a montage, but a fused montage. Where discrete entities are brought together. So just because Gandhi is overlaid with Ambedkar and Shiva and Buddha, like it actually points to that comment about the title, where Ram is, Ramayana is not just a kind of ideal here, but it's a resonance, and it's kind of echoing, providing us a kind of polyvalent understanding of these various figures, like a more overarching history, where it's taking Ambedkar out of Ambedkar in some ways. So,
thank you, Nandini. Yeah, I agree with your last interpretation of that. I think, yes. Thank you. I mean, a 1 hour talk and then for more than half an hour discussion. I think apart from knowing what you are right now thinking about this text, what was more important for us for this whole session was how engaging you kept this whole session.
oh, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for joining us. I'm sure we'll once again, after some time, we'll get back to you for more discussion. Also, thanks to all the participants.
Yeah, thanks to all the participants.
And those who have made this discussion such a wonderful discussion. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you, Nilza.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I think I'm finally audible now. But
yeah, you are.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us. So we'll go. Everyone have a great Sunday, and ma'am, you have a great Saturday and a great weekend ahead.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm closing the session now. Okay. Thanks again, Nandini.
Thank you so much.